Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. As Malaysia and China celebrate 50 years of diplomatic ties, Kuala Lumpur is facing increasing challenges from China in the South China Sea. The Philippines Inquirer reported that in February, Beijing demanded Malaysia immediately cease exploration and development of its oil and gas fields off Sarawak State. And this year alone, Beijing has maintained a continuous presence within Malaysia's exclusive economic zone with at least 8 different Chinese Coast Guard ships, including the Monster 5901, 3 survey vessels, including the Keshui Shan Hao, with maritime militia, including the Chong San Shayu ship. As China ramps up pressure on the nations bordering the contested South China Sea, we ask whether Kuala Lumpur's so-called special relationship with Beijing can escape increasing threats to Malaysia's sovereignty. With us to discuss this are Chiew-Ping, East Asian International Relations Caucus co-founder, and Ronan Fu, Academia Sinica Institute of Political Science Assistant Research Fellow. A very warm welcome to you both on the show today. Thank you. Malaysia is the second largest oil and natural gas producer in Southeast Asia, with about 20% of its GDP coming from oil and natural gas. As the country's oil reserves have gradually been exhausted, it has moved into drilling further offshore, including the seas around Luconia Shoals. China has objected to this, claiming that Malaysia has drilled in Beijing's waters. Professor Hu, let me come to you first. So we don't often hear about, any sort of these tensions between Malaysia and China. How long do you think, though, that there has been this state of play between the two countries?
Well, I think for at least since 2013, so that is when we begin to see that the China Coast Guard has not been established yet, but they were the Coast Guards under the Ocean Administration Council at the time. So they were found to be accompanying the Chinese fishing vessels entering into Malaysian waters. Before then, Malaysia only dealt with Vietnamese fishermen incurring into our EEZ. So it was, I think, around since then, 2013 to 16 especially. So this was when the conflict between Malaysia and China over the South China Sea become more apparent.
Yeah, and you mentioned Vietnam there. How would you say was the difference between the Vietnam's protests, let's call it like that, and the protests from China?
So I think for Malaysia and Vietnam, we are still actively managing the ongoing dispute between us because it involves the common fishing ground. As for China, I think the protest is more about, for example, at the beginning, when you raised that their protest against Malaysia's oil and gas activities in our EEZ.
Okay. Ronan, since 2013, so that is quite a long time. Do you think most people would be surprised about that length of time, given that we don't hear that much about it?
Yeah, I think people will be surprised because the general assumption is that when it comes to China and the Philippines and China and Vietnam, these countries are more vocal in terms of asserting their territorial claims against China. Whereas for Malaysia, basically it normally takes a somewhat more low-key approach. That's the reason why it's, received less media attention. So that is somewhat surprising.
Okay. Now, on that point, when asked in September about Beijing's request to stop Malaysian drilling, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim said that he would not stop exploration within the country's own EEZ, but had no intention of provoking China. He said, of course, we will have to operate in our waters and secure economic advantage, including drilling for oil in our territory. And that was in a televised press conference while visiting Russia. Professor Hu, so those two statements, can they exist together? We will carry on drilling, but we will not provoke China.
Oh, yes, of course. It makes perfect sense for Malaysia. This has been the way what we call a kind of a hedging strategy. So we don't officially acknowledge there is a dispute with China. However, we do believe that we have the right to conduct economic activities within our EEZ. So I don't find contradictions.
Where Beijing will be provoked because Beijing says that they're not your waters?
Oh, well, but we regard that as part of our EEZ, our Malaysian Maritime Zone, so.
Okay, maybe I'll get Ronan's take on that. Do you think that these two statements can exist together when it comes to Beijing?
Yeah, so in theory, yes. In practical sense, very hard to achieve. And that's the reason why even if you employ, for example, open dialogue, diplomacy under the table, or even public diplomacy, the fact that you're trying to assert your territorial claim can be seen as a provocation in the eyes of Beijing. Right, so that's the reason why, in theory, these two can coexist, but in practice, it's very hard to achieve. So two factors basically we have to take into account. Number one is the level of China's assertiveness. So once it reached to the extent that even the Malaysian civil society not, tolerate, that's gonna, exert some pressure on the decision making. Number two is the U.S. factor that cannot go unnoticed. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get on to the US a little bit later. I just want to ask Professor Hu, so it's interesting with the leak to the Inquirer. Otherwise, this letter would not have been published. And I understand that there's a police investigation underway right now to try to find out how this happened. They always want to basically have public displays of friendly relations, just as you mentioned, and to deal with any sort of disputes or differences quietly and privately. So what do you think the impact has been on Malay-China ties?
So it is very normal for the protest letter to be issued to the embassy in Beijing. So I believe what has not been publicized is our reply to that letter. So this has been a regular exchanges between Malaysia and China. So the languages used is not surprising. So I believe what we have replied to Beijing is that we assert our right conducting our own economic and oil and gas activities within our exclusive economic zones. However, we do open for dialogues and also exchange of opinions with China about these issues.
So how common is this? You said that this is quite common.
Yeah, for anyone who did archival research, you would know that such exchange of notes is very frequent.
So Beijing constantly asks Malaysia to stop drilling in its own EEZ?
Well, over news statement and private diplomatic note like this, so it's very common for us to reassert our claim again and again and again. So
but my question was, is it common for Beijing to ask you to stop drilling?
To stop, I think, yeah, it really depends on because the most recent notes will not be open for public to view. So what we have is the past records. And in the past records, we can tell that such protest is very normal and it should not be sensationalized like it is has happened now.
Okay. Ronan, what's your view? Is it being sensationalized?
Yeah, so I want to say that is a very difficult question to answer, but I would like to highlight like actually the leak basically to what we oftentimes call the hand tying effect. Basically, the leak was tied and was hand to the extent that he will have to say something or do something or to appease the possible domestic opposition from the Chinese pressure. If compared to the instances where everything was happening under the table, actually the Prime Minister can do nothing, just engaging in some private, sending some private ambassador to Beijing so that they can talk over some disputed issues. But now, everything is coming in front of the public, and one administration has to do something so that they won't antagonize the domestic society. Okay, now in April 2024, after returning from his first state visit to Beijing, Anwar said that Chinese officials had expressed concerns about drilling in the Kasawari gas field around 25 nautical miles to the southeast of Laconia Shoals, where Malaysia recently completed its largest offshore gas platform. He told lawmakers that if China wants negotiation about Malaysian drilling in its EEZ, then he will negotiate. Professor Hu, does Anwar's approach to Beijing differ from his predecessors?
I would say not really, because Malaysia has always abided by our principal foreign policy approach. in recent years, we actively practicing negotiation and engagement with all sides, so we don't take sides. So on South China Sea, obviously there is a US-China competition element to it. And secondly, Malaysia's national interest and national security are at stake. So for us, it's very important for us to defend our national interest and national security without compromising any of those claims.
Mm. Why is it to do with the US-China rivalry?
Because not only China frequently protesting this is their waters, that we are conducting activities in their waters, US also often come to Malaysia in the form of pressure that you should stand up more to China, or secondly, offering assistance, like if you need help, the US is always there. Mm-hmm. So pressure is definitely coming from both sides. So this is why the element is highly present in Southeast Asia claimant states managing of South China Sea dispute.
Mm. For the Philippines, though, would you say that is a different situation?
Definitely. They are US treaty allies, and they have upgraded the EDCA recently, and the Philippines stake is so much higher right now, so they cannot afford not to choose side. Mm. So in that sense, Malaysia wish not to have to choose the way the Philippines does.
Mm. Ronan, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I just want to, in general, I think I agree with the professor just said. I would further point out that previously, actually, some firmer actions have been taken in past years, such as, for example, submitting formal protests to the United Nations and also openly rejecting China's claim.
It was in a memo to the UN
yes.
about the limits on the continental shelf, and they were uncharacteristically blunt.
In 2020, actually, they formally reject China's territorial claims, and number two, they submit a note verbal to the United Nations in 2022. Mm. Yeah.
So maybe there were some circumstances around that time that led Malaysia to be more assertive. I don't know, Professor Hu, how does what's happening today compare to the 2019-2020 standoff between Malaysia and China? And this was to do with a drill ship called the West Capella.
Right. So the incident actually started when the China Coast Guard ship and the survey ship has not left Malaysian waters since December 2019. So the situation developed to become a standoff that erupted in April 2020. Mm. So during that time, what we did is that the Royal Malaysian Navy and also our Malaysian Coast Guard took turn to witness the West Capella operation. The first to join the standoff is actually Vietnamese maritime militia, because it was at the point of the overlapping claim and dispute between Vietnam and Malaysia as well, so as China. So after China maintained such a very close presence near West Capella, the US, without asking for Malaysian government's opinion, joined in the standoff as well, and then it was later joined by the Australian warship as well. Mm. So the multilateral standoff in West Capella actually strengthened our resolve, in which our defense white paper was just being published in 2009, early 2020. So it reaffirmed our stance that we need to be even more assertive than before when it comes to our South China Sea position.
Assertive towards China?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We actually use the word aggressive describing Chinese behavior in South China Sea.
Right, I see. So that must have been a turning point for Malaysia. Right, let's get on to the US angle. So after receiving Beijing's warning in February 2024, at an ASEAN summit in Melbourne in March, Anwar spoke up for ties with Beijing and complained over alleged pressure by Washington and its allies not to have relations with Beijing. He said, right now, China seems to be the leading investor into Malaysia, and he insisted that Malaysians do not have a problem with China. We are an independent nation. We are fiercely independent. We do not want to be dictated by any force. So, Professor Hu, tell me, what are the relations between Malaysia and US? What are they like?
So Malaysia and US have one of the longest standing defense partnership in Southeast Asia. So aside from the United Kingdom, Australia and New Zealand, which form part of the five-power defense arrangement, US is Malaysia's very important military exercise partner, and also was a participant in many of US security initiatives in the region. So Malaysia-US relation should not be characterized in the way that it is detected by force. And the way Anwar was being guided to answer the questions from the journalists in Melbourne, which I was at the time, being part of the maritime track of the Australia-ASEAN Special Summit at the time. So the way that I read the news and how it was being phrased, I think...
so there was a gap there?
Yeah. So he was being misquoted by many other news afterwards.
So tell me, what did he actually say? What was his actual meaning?
So the question was really about how Malaysia has been responding to, the China question. So he responded firstly by saying that China seemed to be, is not the problem, do not have a problem with, and then another question came about how about the United States? So he was then saying, oh, we don't really need to, abide by or listening to either US or China. I think that is actually the crux of what he's trying to express at the time.
Okay, so the phrase dictated by force was...
Yeah, so it's actually referring to both US and China, if you ask any Southeast Asians.
Right, okay. Ronan, let's go back to the 2020 West Capella incident. Just trying to link in what the Prime Minister said when he said Malaysians or Malaysia does not have a problem with China. Do Malaysians as a whole, from your view, and then we will ask Professor, do they believe that there is this special relationship between Malaysia and China, or have they, been perhaps wondering whether this still exists after some of the incidents where China is definitely infringing on Malaysia's sovereignty in Malaysia's EEZ. There was also an incident in 2021 when Chinese military aircraft, 16 of them, flew above Malaysia's EEZ. I understand that Malaysia was definitely not happy about that incident.
On the one hand, obviously the Malaysia, especially political elites, obviously they won't be happy about what China did in contested territorial water. Yeah, that's for sure. But on the other hand, they don't publicize everything happened in South China Sea for a reason. Because you just asked, do they believe that Malaysia has a special relationship with China? I believe so, but it's also worth pointing out that they also believe that they have a special relationship with the US. So the notion is that they don't want to be caught between the two giants. They want to preserve their autonomy. So on the one hand, they obviously are, they feel uneasy about China's growingly assertiveness. But on the other hand, they want to preserve in some phase for Beijing. But on the other hand, they will desperately hoping that China can just behave itself, exercise some restraint, so that they don't have to basically tilt toward the Washington too much.
How sustainable is hope as a strategy?
I think that's going to be getting extremely difficult if everything is being seen by the public, because that's going to, like I say, generate some audience costs for the administration. Meaning that they have to take into public opinion into account. Previously, they can just do it basically, for example, engaging in some elite-to-elite interaction, and they can talk things over. But now they have to take into what the general public's feelings and vibe into account, and that's going to complicate the matter.
Okay, so let's ask Professor Hu then about the general public in Malaysia. Is it split? Are there some that want the government to stand up perhaps more publicly towards China?
I would say the reaction is quite diverse. So on the one hand, you have the business community who really see the importance of China's business and trade. On the other hand,
We can actually talk about some of those figures in a bit, but I'll let you finish.
So, and also there is the military establishment of Malaysia. So the Malaysian Armed Forces are one of the pusher for a more assertive stance towards China, and so as the Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency. So because they are the one, they are out there in the front line facing the China fishing vessels and the Coast Guard vessels. So in a way, we do lack a kind of resources dedicated by the government in facing the real challenges on the front line. However, we cannot deny that the security and also economic interdependence created a kind of a nexus that the political elites of Malaysia need to be handled very carefully.
Right, okay, so let's go into some of those figures. Now, just this year, Malaysia signed the second round of its 5-year plan for economic and trade cooperation with China. Malaysia was in the first batch of countries to join Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. And on their 50th anniversary, both premiers attended the groundbreaking ceremony of the Gombak Integrated Terminal Station on the East Coast Rail Link, a signature BRI project in Malaysia. So, Ronan, let me come to you. China has been Malaysia's largest trading partner. Now, that's not unique, but for 15 consecutive years, with trade exceeding $98.2 billion in 2023, this actually takes up more than 17% share of Malaysia's total trade. Is Malaysia more dependent on China than other South China Sea claimants?
Yeah, especially when being compared to the Philippines. So
and Vietnam.
Yeah, in Vietnam, obviously. So I would actually from an IPE or national security perspective, the reliance on China actually means some risks. So for example, if you believe that China's economy, which I do believe is slowing down, that's gonna, this slowdown gonna lead to reduced demand for Malaysian exports. So industries such as electronics, natural gas, they will suffer. And I think they have to figure out a way so that they can diversify their trade portfolio. And also, Malaysia is receiving a lot of, investment from China. That's another issue that, when China's economy is slowing down, they have to figure out a way while maintaining robust economic growth for the past couple of years.
Let me quote some more figures, Professor Hu.
Sure.
So in terms of how important gas and oil is for Malaysia itself, if we compare Indonesia, I believe in 2023, oil and gas accounted for 2.5% of GDP. Vietnam, it hovers around 10 to 13% of GDP, whereas Malaysia is significantly more than that, isn't it? 20% of the GDP, is that correct?
Not only Malaysia, Brunei as well. So oil and gas is a very important income for two countries. They are both claimant state to South China Sea. So that's why for economic security reason, Malaysia will not compromise on the oil and gas excavation in our exclusive economic zones.
Yeah. Yes, and I understand that according to the energy regulator, nearly 60% of natural gas resources are located off Sarawak, actually in the EEZ and also within the China's so-called 9- or 10- line. And this is obviously where we see that exploration shifting, because these reserves have been, as we said at the start of the show, starting to dry up. So again, just to bring the show to a close, Anwar has been accused in the West of taking an approach that appeases China rather than being simply neutral. Do you think that as Malaysia continues and goes further and further and out drilling, will he be called on by the public, as Ronan was saying, to be more assertive?
I think we are already being assertive in our own way. So first and foremost, so I understand the stake because I come from the state of Sarawak. So my hometown face exactly where the Luconia show is located at. So with that, what I can see is that our marine resources have been depleting over the years. So for example, the beach side of my childhood is no longer.
Right.
So, so we face greater maritime environmental erosion problem arises, and we definitely don't need this great power competition or even a great power encroachment into our EEZ area. So what Malaysia has done, and UNWA has actually agreed to a new type of military exercises with the United States this year. So we have bilateral Army, bilateral Navy, bilateral Air Force, and also Special Force training with the United States. And this year we have upgraded it, and it will take place in Sarawak. So these are the testament to how we are trying to assert that we are always sending signal to China that, look, we have other partners, we have other friends. So I think China understands that very well too. And this is why bilateral dialogue is always open to manage this kind of a dispute.
Okay. Final words, Ronan.
The last point I want to make is that actually what we want to see in the future is whether, within ASEAN, there'll be like a united bloc expressing concern over China's behavior in South China Sea. Because you do see that in the past, when ASEAN can serve as like a united bloc, this kind of opposition from this united bloc can actually, deter Beijing from doing a lot of things.
We'll have to end it there. Thank you so much
you.
to our guests, Chiew-Ping Hu and Ronan Fu. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.